Hi, Jim. I'm Ann Althouse.
Hi, Ann. I'm Jim Pinkerton, and together
we're
BloggingHeads.tv. As you can see, we've carefully choreographed that intro.
So what's going on?
Well, today is Tuesday afternoon, and I just watched the press conference that Attorney General Holder, plus Secretary Napolitano, Police Chief Ray Kelly, and various other big shots held to discuss the arrest of the fellow from Pakistan, the American citizen from Pakistan, in the Times Square bombing case.
Right.
And there was, if you've been following the case in general, there's no real news there. They yanked. We all know by now they yanked him off the plane, as it was apparently taxiing out of JFK Airport. What was interesting to me, though, was that they volunteered that they did not Mirandize the suspect until, according to, and I didn't quite catch the name of, some sort of Homeland Security provision. They questioned him first, then Mirandized him, and then I guess probably continue to question him.
Interesting. Because I saw that the left-wing blogs were excoriating John McCain for saying they shouldn't Mirandize him. So it'll be interesting to see what they say now that it turns out that they did. Oh, terrible John McCain said that they shouldn't do that, and then that's what Obama did. So.
And that other right-winger, Eric Holder.
Yeah.
It does suggest that we've reached a bit of a threshold here, and I just sort of wonder whether, the Miranda era, which I guess began in 1966, has sort of coming to an end now, when we realize that the stakes for some criminal, homeland security, national security situations are so high that you just can't afford it.
Well, I think one thing is that Miranda is about excluding the evidence that's arrived at before the person is Mirandized. So you could question the person for intelligence purposes, get the information out that you want that way, and then when you're ready to go into the Miranda mode and give the person a lawyer, then you do that. And at that point, you can get evidence that you could use at trial, and it's all about what's excluded at trial, assuming you go to criminal trial. I mean, a follow-on issue is whether a person who's charged with being an enemy combatant or whatever is going to go to criminal trial. Obviously, that's been a big issue. But you could have Miranda, but it's just in connection with what's excluded from evidence at a criminal trial.
Right, you could. That's right. And it was also interesting that apparently this fellow became a U.S. citizen in 2009, which makes me think that there'll be a fair amount of discussion as to precisely whose idea it was to make him a citizen, and under what rules and so on, and what sort of judgment goes into these decisions to let somebody become a citizen.
Do you see this connecting up with the immigration issue that is being brought into the foreground?
Yeah, I do. I've been saying to people for years that the future of American immigration politics is Jean-Marie Le Pen, who's not an American. He's the French anti-immigration activist who was called every name in the book that we've heard in relation to Arizona for the last, they called him a fascist and a Nazi and so on, and, he was a paratrooper in World War II for the French, and he was just simply against unlimited immigration.
And now, aren't the French very much about assimilation and people becoming French and not seeing people as belonging to different ethnic groups? I mean, I know that in reality it doesn't quite work that way, but in America we have this idea that difference of opinion is something that's part of the American way, and the idea that you're going to take a test, you're going to be tested for citizenship, and we're somehow going to figure out whether you're truly a citizen that has something to do with assimilation. There's a little bit of an incoherence or a discord with American values about that, but maybe with the case with this, what is his name, Faisal, who was arrested in the bombing. And that he got, from what you just said, I got the idea that you're saying something like, how was he allowed to become a citizen? Why didn't they detect how un-American he was? And so I guess I'm wondering if you think that, quite apart from whether we're giving people legality as far as being in the country, that the process of becoming citizens ought to be jacked up to a level that has something more to do with assimilationist values.
Sure, absolutely. Of course, I think that, and that was American wisdom for the first century and a half. If they didn't Americanize you at Ellis Island, they would do it in the public schools. Nobody got into this country before, say, the '60s without having at least some brush with Americanism. For a while there, you were signing loyalty oaths.
But how do you accord that with the idea of the belief in diversity, the idea that dissent is patriotic, and all that? So do you think for the newcomers they don't get to dissent?
I don't believe in those. I don't believe those things. I don't particularly believe diversity is a value. I think culture is a value. I do believe in free speech. I do believe in dissent, but as Peter Beinart wrote in a terrific piece about Elena Kagan, the Solicitor General, I'm sure we'll come back to the Supreme Court in a moment. Yeah. He said not only is dissent patriotic, but assent is patriotic, as in sometimes your country calls upon you to do things and you do it even though you don't agree, just because that's part of the duty of a citizen. I think we've been sold a bill of goods about the value of diversity. People who want to cut heads off of other people and who want to castrate girls and marry them off at the age of 12. I don't think that's American, and I don't think people like that should be in America.
Did you notice that this group that had been arrested? Let's see, what was that? I'm trying to get this one. Well, these Hootery or.
Yeah, the Michigan. Yeah. Your fellow Midwesterners.
Did I say the name right?
Huttery or Hootery, yeah, something like that.
That the judge released that there wasn't enough evidence to hold them before trial, that they were released. I guess they're going to be monitored or something like that. But there's some question about how early or how appropriate it is to detain or have the government become involved with people who are expressing dissenting ideas. And so, maybe there's a different standard for people who want to become citizens, but it would seem to me if you're going to become a new American citizen, that you should have the same rights that everybody else has.
What? Now, wait a second, you're saying a foreigner trying to become an American citizen should have the same rights as an American citizen?
Once he is, that's the thing. You have to get through the threshold. Once you are an American, the idea that you could criticize the government, that you could have dissenting views, you could in fact even want, I guess you can't want the government, you have a right to express your view that the government should be overthrown, that there should be a revolution, but I can see blocking citizenship to anyone who wants it.
I just think in a world, this is a world of 6.5 billion people, a great many of whom despise the United States, and public opinion polls across 30 countries in the world show overwhelming majorities supporting terrorism, supporting bin Laden, supporting, insurgencies against the United States. Again, in terms of their country, that's probably what you'd expect. But the idea that we would let them into this country to live here, even as tourists, to say nothing of being illegals, is nuts. That's, as Justice Jackson said in his famous dissent in the Supreme Court from the 40s, the Constitution is not a suicide pact.
By the same token, there are a lot of people who would like to become American citizens, and if we're going to have a country built on immigration, why not pick people who deserve it in some way?
There's a lot to be said for that, but then you need a pretty extensive bunch of tests, don't you, to keep out the shazads and let in the future Nobel Prize winners. That's exactly what you test for. Yeah. And you won't get it perfectly, but you'll at least. I think that a good many Muslim jihadist types would flunk a basic loyalty oath, observed behind a one-way, a two-way mirror. So,
but I think people would know what the appropriate lies were. I think maybe the most devious people would tell the appropriate lies, and all we would screen out would be some honest people who were just actually being reflective and taking advantage of a range of free expression that, if they actually were citizens, we would celebrate.
Maybe, but the reservoir of support by which these people always seem to end up coming from Brooklyn or Detroit or someplace where there's a community, and if the community were smaller, there'd be less support for them. Again, I don't say that loyalty oaths and so on are any kind of a silver bullet on this. Obviously, we need all the tools of police work and the Patriot Act and so on as well. But I think we obviously need to step up our game. And again, I began my little report on the press conference today by noting that the Obamans seem to have swung in, to use your word, a McCain-like direction on this issue of Mirandizing people. And this guy was a U.S. citizen. I mean, 4 months ago, on Christmas Day, they were so precious about that Nigerians, even though he wasn't an American, he still had constitutional rights in Holder's view. And then, of course, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who's also not an American citizen, he was going to get a trial. He was going to get a civilian trial. So in other words, the Obamans, in a way that's pretty predictable, frankly, have moved away from the ACLU position to something much closer to what the average American would call common sense when it comes to Homeland Security.
I guess I voted for Obama, and I always thought he was a pragmatist, and so when he makes a pragmatic adjustment, I guess I like that. Oh, by the way, I feel like I, as a law professor, have to give this other Justice Jackson quote, as long as you quoted Justice Jackson. If there's any fixed star in our constitutional constellation, it is that no official, high or petty, can prescribe what shall be orthodox in politics, nationalism, religion, or other matters of opinion, or force citizens to confess by word or act. That's one of the great quotes in all of the Supreme Court reporters, and I'd just like to bring that into any kind of testing. Did I hear you say
any officials could do that?
There's no official can prescribe what shall be orthodox.
That doesn't say law can't do it. I mean, when they were passing the Smith Act, against communism, and whenever that was, 1940 or 1941, and the McCarran-Walter Act, did Jackson dissent from those?
I'd have to look into it.
Okay, well, you're the law professor. You could maybe.
I mean, something tells me database in my head.
Something tells me that he was understood that the exigencies of World War II and the Cold War just required that we have, again, as I said before, more tools at our disposal to keep
That quote was from the case where the Jehovah's Witnesses were given a First Amendment right not to have to say the Pledge of Allegiance, not to salute the flag. But I think it's an important idea.
Common sense tells us. I think that the Gobitis case, I think that was in 1940.
It was Barnett overruling Gobitis. Gobitis was the case where they accepted using things like loyalty oaths to win patriotism, that was seen as acceptable. So I think really the dominant constitutional view has been that this idea of prescribing orthodoxy. Now, is exactly what we don't want.
Dominant constitutional view in the last half century. That was my point. Yeah. Since you can look, when you win a war, when you win World War II and you're triumphant in the world and you're hanging in there in the Cold War, you can afford to have a Miranda rule and let the Warren Court let crime quintuple in the 60s and 70s. You can do that. Well, when you come across mortal enemies potentially with A-bombs, things change.
But now let's examine the way this Times Square fellow really had the exact opposite of an A-bomb. I think you wrote about this in your piece, that these are just anybody can put gas and fertilizer or whatever in some toy alarm clock into an SUV and drive it into Times Square.
Right.
There's no
which is to say there's hundreds and millions and billions of dangerous objects in America. Every gun, every automobile, every gasoline canister, every bag of fertilizer is potentially dangerous. Mm-hmm. Okay, so in other words, you're never, as I wrote in that piece for FoxNews.com, you're never going to get very far trying to police the dangerous things. Mm-hmm. The only thing you're left to do then is police the dangerous people.
The minds.
Police behavior, at least. Police behavior. I mean, more to the point, just be police. I mean, the cops have been dealing with dangerous people and suspicious people for centuries. And again, the Warren Court came along and said, "Oh no, this guy's not dangerous. He's just exercising his civil liberties." Mm-hmm. And I'm just saying, I don't think that era survives what we're seeing right now.
And what about religious freedom? Do you think that too doesn't survive?
I think religious freedom in a loyalty oath, loyal context. I mean, again, a religion. I mean, John Locke, who was one of the patron saints of American libertarianism and civil libertarianism, was not. You're talking about a man who had lived mostly in the 17th century. He was not for the free rights for Catholics at the time, because he said, as an Englishman, as an English Protestant, because he said, look, the Catholics are controlled by the Pope, and if they come here, they won't exercise their rights as free Englishmen. They will just do what the Pope tells them to. Now that may or may not be a fair assessment of Catholicism in the 17th century. But
I have my picture of John F. Kennedy right behind me, and I was just thinking of him when he ran for president. People thought he wouldn't. Here's my John F. Kennedy. That people thought he wouldn't be able to be president because he was beholden to the Pope. Would you hold that view?
No, I'm just saying. I think things have changed, and Kennedy went out of his way to say that wouldn't be the case for him. I think we're in a sufficiently dire situation. I mean, we've now been attacked directly or indirectly from Saudi Arabia, Afghanistan, Jordan, Yemen, Pakistan, and meanwhile we're in war in Iraq and Afghanistan and a little bit Pakistan. I mean, there's 30 countries where you could say that a terrorist who struck and killed or tried to kill Americans came from. And that just requires a certain common sense about what's happening, especially when, as you pointed out, there's so many dangerous objects. I mean, every automobile and fertilizer bag and gas canister is a potential deadly weapon. You just can't then operate on this presumption that somebody saying dangerous, crazy things and sending emails and leaving a long trail is anything other than an obvious security risk who's got to get investigated immediately. You can only do that with pretty sophisticated police tactics.
So you really want to police people's minds. You say there's so many dangerous objects that there's nothing we can do about the objects anymore. We have to go after the people's minds. We have to look at... with these hootery folks that the judge said couldn't be held, you would have held them, right?
I don't know. I don't know the case. But I put it this way: I certainly think that the kind of police work that let's take the case we know about for sure, Nidal Hassan, the army officer who shot and killed 13 fellow soldiers at Fort Hood, Texas last year. Okay, he was sending emails all over the place to everybody. I mean, as I also wrote in that Fox News piece, these people tend to be, part of conspiracies and movements. They can't, for whatever part of the psychology of being a terrorist, they have to tell somebody. They need moral support from some little, coterie. And so there's Timothy McVeigh or Nidal Hassan, or this guy, Shahzad, they all seem to be in touch with other people. And it just requires some mechanism for keeping track of that. And then the police, of course, on the street have to be prepared to look out and deal with dangerous people. And then now we get, again, you're the law professor. You can talk about, 40 years of jurisprudence on what probable cause is, but I'll just tell you that my argument is that the first 160 years of jurisprudence on probable cause, which causes the ACLU to shudder, is probably a better window into where we're headed than assuming that we can live by the ACLU view of the past few decades. I don't think that survives too many more of these kind of terror assaults.
Well, that's. The question is doing it well. Surveillance. How much surveillance? How much are we really going to look into people's minds? And
looking into people's minds is nobody's talking about that. I'm saying they leave trails.
Mm-hmm. No, I agree. We should do good intelligence.
Police work says they leave trails.
Yeah.
And when they leave a trail, we should know where it is. Otherwise, we're going to lose the city.
Now, if you have this kind of faith in government that it can figure these things out and put things together and enforce a rule of law, then why haven't we seen any decent enforcement on immigration?
Because powerful forces in this country don't want immigration reform. There's leftist multiculturalists who, in their vision of sort of diversity as a great value, are all for open borders. And then in a remarkably Faustian bargain, they're joined by many businesses, maybe most businesses, who want cheap labor. They want guaranteed union-busting, scab, sub-minimum wage employees at their fast food restaurant, at their agribusiness, at their slaughterhouse, and so on. And so between the two of them, they have successfully sabotaged border enforcement for half a century.
Mm-hmm. So you think if they only wanted to do it?
I think that I have enough faith in the government that if the people and their representatives are saying this is really important to us. We, like World War II, for example. World War II is really important. We made plenty of mistakes in the course of fighting that war and so on, but on the whole, we did pretty well because we really wanted to do it. We wanted to stamp out child pornography, and I think we've probably done a reasonably good job of doing that. We wanted to stamp out mercury and certain heavy metals in our environment. Probably done a good job at that. You obviously need a consensus, and what I'm saying is I think the consensus on homeland security and border security is rapidly emerging, and just as say Tom Tancredo or Pat Buchanan were regarded as dangerous, menacing figures 20 years ago or 10 years ago or even 2 years ago, I think even if they never get credit for being early advocates for border security, the conventional wisdom, the Eric Holders and the Barack Obamas of 10 years from now will talk a lot like them in terms of the practical reality of homeland security and border enforcement.
So if they're responsive to these pragmatic concerns, you were talking about it before, about the Times Square bomber and so forth, how much do you think they're adjusting, or they've already adjusted to the reactions to the Arizona law? I mean, it seems like at first there was all of this demagoguing that, it was race discrimination, it was terrible, and it wasn't what American people, it's not the American way, and so forth. But then some polls came out, and it seems like there was a bit of a readjustment, but not to the point where it seems like they would actually want to enforce the law, as you were just talking about. But it seems like an adjustment has already been made to those.
Right.
That response to the Arizona
law. I agree with that. I mean, it's two data points. One, there's this Arizona State Senator named Sylvia Allen, who just is a from Snowflake, Arizona. I think it's sort of a tongue-in-cheek name. And she said, look, even now, all this talk about border security is like that. They don't actually secure the border. They operate checkpoints 60 to 80 miles inside of Arizona for reasons, I can't quite fathom. But the point is, she's still saying even now it's still a sham, border security. And then there's also, I would point our viewers to a piece by Paul Theroux in the Daily Beast. This is Tuesday, the 4th. And he's made a career out of writing about travel. He's been all over the world and said, everywhere you go in the world, they ask you for your papers. You can't check into a hotel without producing a passport. And if they think you're a foreigner, you got to produce more identification. It just said, look, it is so understood that that's just what cops and countries do. For routine, keeping track of things. He also has a little story about a woman from Sudan. He was in Sudan, and she was living. He met her in Khartoum, Sudan, and yet she lived in New York and was just coming back on vacation. And how did she get from Sudan to New York City in the first place? Well, she went to Mexico and crossed the border illegally. That kind of proves every paranoid Fox News scenario you can imagine. Except those paranoid Fox News scenarios have a way of being true. There are thousands of people who are not Mexicans crossing the border from Mexico, including many from Yemen and Saudi Arabia and other countries like that. So I just think you're right. The political culture declared every Republican and every supporter of this bill in SB 1070 in Arizona to be a fascist or a Nazi or both. And they kind of made their point, but as the smoke clears and they realize that the country didn't follow them in their little campaign, they're now kind of backing off. Although I wouldn't be in the least surprised to see the ACLU, which never takes the hint, they will be looking for some judge to throw the thing out of court, which would then really cause a firestorm if they pulled a Roe versus Wade on this bill.
It seems like the Arizona people who drafted the law were really trying to track federal law, and they were pretty sensitive to federal law, and the early attempts to characterize it as, Arizona veering right-wing or whatever were met with the text of the law and how it was crafted to track federal law, and that the requirement that non-citizens have their papers on them is a part of federal law. And the reason they wrote the law the way they did was to be like federal law, but just enforce it. So, I mean, I think there's some questions of whether the feds have exclusive control over immigration and that there's no room for the states, but they try to be sensitive to that by making their law really track federal law, but with some actual enforcement, so that it kind of stands as a criticism of the feds for having law but then not enforcing it.
Right. I mean, I think everybody who supported this law in Arizona would jump at the chance to say, look, if the feds would build a fence across the border, 90% of the political passion on these issues would go away. It's that rancher who got murdered, and that policeman who got shot and wounded just the other day. I mean, that's the kind of stuff that sends everybody into orbit, and rightfully so. That if the federal government is spending $3 or $4 trillion a year now, and of all the things the government's spending money on, including $250 billion a year with the foreign wars, it can't be bothered to defend the U.S. border. That's pretty galling. Mm-hmm. And again, I kind of agree with you that Obama is sort of a pragmatist at heart. And I think it is slowly dawning on him that the pragmatics of governing and the pragmatics of getting reelected are a good deal different than the briefings he's been getting from his lefty lawyers at the Justice Department.
But there are a lot of Hispanic voters, and there'd be a lot more if there were amnesty. So that adds a factor to the pragmatic analysis that makes it very unwieldy, very hard to decide which way to.
Well, except look, if every Hispanic voted, they'd be, I'm going to guess, tops 20% of the population. And I'm not at all convinced. I mean, if you get to 70% support in Arizona for the bill, that tells me a lot of Hispanics, have the same view of this. I mean, again, the left purports to speak for them and says all Hispanics are against this and so on. Well, if you're a small businessman or a property owner or just a citizen or going to school, and you're worried about crime and violence. I mean, what's going on in Mexico in terms of, 24,000 people killed in the drug war, including 1,100 government officials. 1,100 government officials. That's got to have a pretty sobering effect on a lot of people's thinking, not just the proverbial, retired Anglo golf player in Arizona.
Speaking of real facts in the world that affect what politicians can do with their various policies, what do you think of this Gulf oil leak? That seemed to be awfully fortuitous occurrence when Obama was calling for drilling, and then the next thing that happens is we have this horrible oil spill.
Right. It would almost make you think that environmentalists tucked away in the Obama administration were happy to see the oil spill get worse.
Well, they don't seem to be acting that quickly, and then they're folding it into their sort of corporate demonization.
Yeah, I put it this way. I was lucky enough to work in the White House under two presidents for 6 years under Reagan and Bush 41, and pretty quickly, even as a peon, you figured out what the president cared about and what he didn't care about. Mm-hmm. And, you can just tell from, looking at the president's schedule and looking at his speeches, what he's been focusing on. And it's pretty, I think the oil spill was, April 10th? Something like that. I mean, it's been a while. Or it was definitely, last month. And when did they have their first meeting on it? Has he been convening? I mean, the rap on Bush 43, on Katrina, was that he was making a speech on the Iraq War in San Diego when it happened, and then as we all remember, took a low flight over just to take a look, and then flew back to Washington.
I think that Obama would at least be concerned that he could preserve his Bush was terrible about Katrina argument. I mean, it's the same city that's threatened. You would think that he would want to at least look very proactive, so that he could keep the political benefit of being able to say Bush dragged his feet on Katrina, Bush doesn't care about black people, things of that sort.
Right. The hardest thing in any executive position is to stay focused on what's really important, including the realization that it changes sometimes. And I mean, nobody thinks that Bush 43 put a very high priority on Homeland Security until 9/11. Mm-hmm. That famous briefing from the early August, where Bin Laden plans to attack in the United States, doesn't seem to have cause much of a ripple inside the government because the president didn't think it was very important. As he said to the CIA briefer, okay, you covered yourself, now get lost while I go play golf. And that's enough of a signal to the government that what the president's really worried about is stem cell research or whatever the big issue of the summer about or sharks, whatever the issue of the summer of
stem cells. He wanted to make a show of thinking it through and coming up with this compassionate, measured. That was the political theater of that time.
Right, exactly. That was the White House spin doctors were saying, this is our president, being deliberative and thoughtful and all this stuff. And he was deliberative and thoughtful about an issue that's about 100th on the list of concerns the American people have, especially certainly after 9/11. And anyway, so whatever we could go back and look, and I'm sure political scientists will do this and say, okay, on the day of the oil spill, on the day of this, the president had a cabinet meeting on this and a National Security Council meeting on that, and gave a speech on this, and so on and so on. And meanwhile, whatever hapless bureaucrats and Coast Guard officials and we're not given whatever the full total authority of the government is, to do something. If we now read apparently there's no booms in the Gulf of Mexico. Why aren't there any booms, to cordon off the oil? Again, if the government really and truly wants to do something, it has a way of doing it. So if it doesn't do it, that tells me they didn't really care that much. And whether it's border security or homeland security, which I think is changing, but now we have oil security, for lack of a better word, and again, we're going to say, gee, Mr. President, less time spent, plotting and scheming Middle East peace, and more time spent trying to figure out how to keep, the entire Gulf of Mexico from being soaked in oil.
Well, I think it looks really, really bad that they can't do anything about it. It does create some kind of a sense that they actually want it to look bad so that people will give up on the idea of offshore drilling for good. It's like 3 Mile Island, or what was that China syndrome? Or
Daryl Gates, the former chief of police of Los Angeles, who sort of just died recently, whose history sort of records, okay, if you cops, if you, the people of Los Angeles, are mad at the cops because of Rodney King and so on, and police brutality and whatnot, okay, we'll show you what life is like without the police. And this is a line of argument that does seem to comport with the fact that the riot in L.A. got a lot of momentum with no cops anywhere in sight, because Gates said no, fine, we'll just keep the police sitting around their headquarters, and now you'll see what it's like without us. Then you'll see how much you miss us, and you kind of wonder whether there's not a similar element of we told you so, and now you have to listen in this oil spill.
Well, that's all very frighteningly childish. What else to say about that?
Other than the fact that human nature, human nature is every possible emotion, adult and childish at the same time, and all of us are at one time or another are subject to it. So,
yeah. So do you have any hope for some glorious Supreme Court justice?
Well, you tell me. Who you must have some inter-office betting pool going on. Who are you betting on?
I just think I'm not betting, but as far as I'm writing about it, I think a liberal president is entitled to appoint a liberal justice. And what I would like to see, I've said this before, I'm blowing ahead, but so excuse me if I'm repeating myself, but I think the president has the appointment power. He should appoint someone who is the kind of justice that he thinks there should be. And what I would like to see, you're a liberal, appoint a liberal, and let's see the liberal defend the liberal theories of constitutional interpretation. What I don't like is these people that get the nomination by signaling that they're liberal, but then when they speak to us, they talk as if they support conservative Supreme Court ideology, the constitutional interpretation. And they ape John Roberts, who apparently did the best ever hearings before the Senate Judiciary Committee. I would like to see him pick someone who would defend the way I hear inside the academy all the time. Inside the legal academy, hardly anyone defends the sort of constitutional interpretation that you always hear spoken about outside of law school, as if everyone understands this. Inside of law school, there's a liberal approach to constitutional interpretation. I would like to see Obama pick somebody who would talk to us about that and defend it.
Haven't the American people rejected that liberal interpretation?
Well, that's why they won't do it, yes.
Yeah, exactly.
So the prediction is they won't do it, but I'd like to see them do it anyway.
Okay, you want to
I want to go through that.
A cynic might just say you're looking forward to a car wreck.
Yeah, I'd like to. It would be. No one would die in this wreck.
No, it would not be a death.
But I think it would be.
I mean, a cynic would say, "You're just we want the liberals to go out there and charge, across the Lake Brigade in the Crimea and get massacred," which I think is what would happen.
Don't expose my game. I do. Yes, of course. But the point I'm trying to make is there is a liberal approach to constitutional interpretation that's pervasive throughout the legal academy, that law students hear all the time, that's in all kinds of legal writing. And no one dares to come out and say it to ordinary people. It just can't even be said. I think there's something wrong with that.
There is something wrong. That tells me there's something wrong with the law schools. The law schools have become their own little hothouse. I don't know how you got tenure, but with a few exceptions, law schools are just little orchid factories of left-wing people. And again, a great example, and I mentioned her before, is Elena Kagan. Mm-hmm. Peter Beinart, in the same piece I mentioned, said, look, if you don't think that the U.S. military should recruit at Harvard, as she didn't, then you aren't fit to be a Supreme Court justice, which I kind of agree with.
When that case was going up, there was in my law school, University of Wisconsin, they wanted the faculty to sign the brief that was on the same side that you're speaking about, the side Elena Kagan was on. There was a faculty meeting that was led by someone who was quite passionate about it. There was some discussion of whether the faculty is any kind of a unit that can sign as a group onto something. But no one, including me, spoke up for the position that we actually should want students to be able to interview on campus with the military. And the matter of don't ask, don't tell is federal law. That really is the policy that the military has to follow. And as far as students seeking jobs in the military, they should be able to interview on campus. But the other idea was just so prevalent that no one spoke in favor of not supporting that side of it. So there's nothing extraordinary about Elena Kagan being on that side, because virtually everyone that I knew was on that side.
So what's the policy at Wisconsin?
Well, the Supreme Court case was lost. So
but what's the... You have to take them. Okay, you have to. Okay,
you have to give equal access. You have to give equal access. You can't have a special rule excluding the military. That's the Solomon Amendment.
Okay, all right, great. Well, in any case, I thought it was Peter Beinart is no conservative, and I thought it was an interesting, shot across her bow, Ms. Kagan's.
Yeah. But look at what Peter Beinart is up to. Then we'll look at what these people are. A number of people are up to. They think Elena Kagan isn't going to be liberal enough, and he's been pushing for Diane Wood. I flagged this article, Why Should We Want to Put a Mom on the Court, which Peter Beinart wrote. And it goes on about how, we should want women who are mothers on the court. And, to me, it's just kind of garbage to talk about women that way. He makes the argument that we want a role model for girls, that you can be a mother and still have a career, like it's 1975. And I really just think that what he's really driving at is don't pick Elena Kagan, pick Diane Wood because she's a mother. But that's not about motherhood at all. It's about I want the liberal. So people are willing to say a lot of things, I think, ridiculous things. Why don't they come out and say what they really mean, which is that they want the more liberal person? Openly say what you want if that's what you want. Defend and persuade on that.
So what is more liberal than Kagan?
Yeah.
Wow.
But that's what they say. Who knows what they'll really be like when they're on the court, I mean, Kagan has not been a judge, so we haven't seen her opinions. Sometimes people who seem liberal in politics can be pretty conservative when they're on the court. But if you want a liberal on the court, you might want a better security that you really have picked a liberal.
Well, I mean, I think that their major concern is getting somebody confirmed, and
but they're going to get confirmed. The person will be confirmed, and there will be a fight. One thing that a lot of people are saying that I agree with is there's going to be the Republicans are going to use the Supreme Court appointment process to make their as a political issue, because it's very strong for conservatives to argue about conservative constitutional interpretation. And so there's a confirmation process. They're going to use it to air all the usual issues with the fall elections coming up.
And they'll be popular, which should tell you something.
Yeah, but no, yeah, that's true. But we're going to have that argument no matter who he appoints, and the person is going to be confirmed unless some weird defect comes out. It's not going to be anything about ideology, because they know how to speak. They know what not to say. You don't act like the liberal equivalent of Bork. You act like the liberal equivalent of John Roberts, and everyone knows how to do the ritual. It's ridiculous, but that's what's going to happen. So why not pick the person that you really want? Because
so you're saying that the issue then is paper trails, and John Roberts is famous for not having much of a paper trail.
No, for saying the right thing. Well, yeah, you do. You have to not have some horrible thing there. And I think
so speaking of horrible things, I can't resist asking. You've been writing considerably about this girl at Harvard.
Yeah.
Tell us about that.
Well, there was a student at Harvard who had had a conversation. I'm going on what the reports are. I don't know if this is entirely accurate or what will come out, but the way the reports are, it seems that there is a woman, I think a third-year law student at Harvard Law School, who's done very well and has a prestigious clerkship coming up, and was in private discussions with two other students in which they argued about affirmative action and some things of that sort, and questions about race and intelligence. And the woman expanded on what she had said at dinner by making a statement to the effect of of saying that she didn't rule out that there could be a genetic difference in race, or that there's a genetic I should get the language exactly right if I'm going to say what she said, but let me get this predisposition. We cannot absolutely rule out the possibility that African Americans are on average genetically disposed to lower intelligence, something of that sort. If I'm getting it exact, I should get it better than that. I absolutely do not rule out the possibility that African Americans are on average genetically predisposed to be less intelligent. So, she was and then all we get is her email. So we have this quote. It's, I think, by its own terms, part of a context of a discussion that we don't know, and it was put in private email to two other students, and it was subsequently leaked, possibly because somebody has another kind of dispute with the other person. But, of course, the student that wrote the email has gotten publicly reamed, including at her law school, with the dean weighing in and so forth, and with a lot of people, including some bloggers on the internet, saying that her life should be ruined. She should lose her clerkship because of this. Her career should be ruined. She should become just an outcast because she didn't rule out the possibility that something could be true, which to me seems like you're not really saying much other than you're acting like it's okay to talk about this subject, which should perhaps be seen as not fruitful or too hurtful to talk about. But that's what she did in private email. The email was subsequently leaked, and now it's become this sort of national controversy that everyone is talking about. But I think it's shifted over to being also about free speech. How risky is speech, especially speech in your private email, that somehow breaks out into the world, and then you become a pariah because you have said something perhaps the wrong way or dared to speak about one of the topics that good people are supposed to know they're not allowed to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, anybody who says that there's no standards in America anymore, maybe there's no standards on, sex and pornography and stuff, but there sure are standards on what you can say about certain issues and certain words you can or can't use, and you got to recycle. So in other words, it would seem to me that the moral puritanicalism of one era has sort of shifted in a new direction, and there's still deep taboos on certain subjects. They're just different. I mean, than they used to be. And it will be interesting to see what happens with this girl. Something tells me, even 40 years out, we can predict that she's never going to get nominated to the Supreme Court.
Yeah, well, that's possible. You can't live your life around preserving that option, and you'll never get to do anything. But I think it's important for that part of. I'm a big proponent of free speech. I think part of free speech is that when you say something, people say things back to you. That there's an interchange, and that part of being in a culture within a law school where people are debating, including about issues about race and sensitive, complicated topics, part of the reason why we want to bring people together and why we care about diversity in the classroom is that when you say things, you see how other people react, and they react to you, and you interact. And I think that the people who are reacting to you and showing that they're upset by what you've said, they're exercising free speech too. And part of why we care about free speech is that, there's a marketplace of ideas where people interact with each other and the best ideas win and so forth. So you get to find out the effect of your ideas on other people's minds. That is part of the whole free speech dynamic that we care about. But if you scare people so much about speaking that they don't want to speak at all, you lose the dynamic too. People will just retreat into their separate cocoons or the little echo chambers and talk to each other, and then you don't have this testing of ideas.
But
what I'm afraid of is, if you put it in...
for ideological diversity as being more important than ethnic diversity?
Well, I mean, the idea of diversity that was accepted by the Supreme Court in the Grutter case, the University of Michigan Law School case, was not just race per se. It was the whole person, the person as an individual, that you want different kinds of people. And race is one aspect of human experience that you would want to be represented in the classroom, or that the school should be free to be able to construct a student body out of. For educational purposes. And specifically what the Supreme Court accepted was the idea that students should see that another student who happens to be of a particular race isn't just the exemplar of that race or the representative of that race, but is an individual. So you want enough people of different races so that the person isn't just the token, but is who they really are, an individual. It has to do with seeing people as individuals. That's right. The official, accepted by the Supreme Court version. It's not really quite what people in law school.
In your observation, I mean, in the law schools, the leading law schools of America, are they at all interested in that kind of ideological diversity? The leaders of those schools?
I think that there's a range of diversity that people like, and that it varies, and that people who are really liberal will think something that's just a little bit conservative. It's really right-wing and just off the scale, it's not even in the range of things we can talk about. I mean, I think everyone would agree that if you're trying to have a discussion, there's certain things that are outside of the range of rational, decent conversation that's just not helpful to even have that material in the conversation. But different people have a different idea of where that range is, and lefties will go way left on what's acceptable and normal and professional and belongs in a law school classroom discussion, and people who are more conservative will go into an area that some people would just scoff at and leave out. I mean, I think that there are people who teach law school, for example, who when they get to an opinion written by Justice Scalia or Justice Thomas will just scoff at it and kind of get the other students to start scoffing at it, because I will see in my own classroom where I take all the opinions seriously, and I expect you to understand how all of these opinions go. These are people on the court. You should have to read that and understand it and respond to that. To ask a student to respond to something written by Justice Scalia and have them go, Justice Scalia, as if I would accept that as an answer? Well, I can see that in some of the other classes. That is not just accepted as an answer, but that's the official answer.
Yeah, and your little example about how the military recruiting issue is so one-sided as an anti-military. And I mean, if you had the entire the bulk of the law school mowing dissenters into silence, so there's only one voice at the law school, to take a position which is antithetical to the American tradition, to the American military as an institution, and finally, as you pointed out, to American law itself, which I guess finally brought him around. But it is telling that kind of diversity, or the lack of diversity, is...
There was no one there that even wanted to say it. I mean, I was there, and I thought of saying it, I considered saying it, but I could see how the vote was going to go, and I liked the person who was making the proposal, and I knew a lot of people wanted to support her. She made the position very passionately, and, I didn't stick my neck. I mean, maybe today I would, but at the time, and I wasn't particularly cowed into silence. I just had things I wanted to say, but I didn't quite say it. And, that's really the way it goes. When I went to law school, which was I graduated from law school, NYU Law School in 1981, and that was a year before the Federalist Society was founded. And the Federalist Society was founded really to give a voice to more conservative viewpoints within the law school, to make it easier for conservative students to find each other and to more legitimate that kind of talking about the law. I went to law school before that happened, and really the whole dynamic of law school everybody just knew how you were supposed to speak. I mean, you are sort of, when you go to law school, learning how to seem like one of the lawyers. You know, you go in and you're not professional yet, and you're trying to join the culture, so you observe what other people do. What is the discourse like? And you do want to socialize yourself because you want to come out sounding and looking the right way. And I was very disappointed that the conservative viewpoint just wasn't represented, which to me now as a teacher, I just don't think that that's a good enough education. I think it's absurd to think that the conservative viewpoint is not even in the range of things that lawyers talk about. You're going to get a cold awakening in the real world.
Wow. So of all the faculty at the University of Wisconsin, what percentage do you think voted for McCain last year, 2 years ago?
Well, I didn't, and I'm a big right-wing blocker, and I didn't even vote for McCain.
So is it zero?
Law professors?
Is it? Well, I'm just curious. I don't know. I mean, Madison has a certain reputation overall. I'm just kind of curious. I'll entertain any number between 0 and 10, with anything over 10 stretching my credulity. But
no, I would think maybe 2 or 3. Well, I didn't hear anyone talking about that.
No. Well, anyway.
Although McCain is not, there are a lot of reasons not to vote for McCain. I don't think McCain is a good enough exemplar of conservative values. I mean, he threatened, to me, one of the reasons I voted against him was that he wasn't a good enough principled conservative. I mean, if you're going to get a liberal, why not get one that's a little more, is actually going to pin the liberal responsibilities on the Democratic Party rather than delaying for another 4 years. The time when we will get some kind of sharp definition of what it is to be conservative. I mean, I think it's healthy to go through this period where the Democrats control and the conservatives have to redefine themselves and crispen up what they are and get some backbone and get a chance to see what being conservative really is, so they don't just nominate another McCain.
And they don't vote for bailouts and stuff. Yeah, I kind of agree. I think it has been sort of a healthy process. Yeah, it's happening. I think a big test is going to be this deficit commission, which they proposed to the country, the Congress. The Congress rejected it. Obama did it anyway, and now they have, I think it's 18 members, of which 6 are Republicans from the Congress. I think that's right. 3 and 3 from the House and Senate, and I mean, you kind of wonder what they're doing there at this deficit commission.
You think it'll have an effect?
No. No, I don't.
But you seemed hopeful about it a moment.
I'm sorry?
You seemed hopeful about it.
No, I'm not hopeful. I was just observing that it existed. I think that I think the purpose of such things, and I went through one sort of a version of that, and I was against it then too, in the Bush 41 years on the Read My Lips pledge-breaking tax increase, is you get both parties in a clinch, and you kind of come up with some compromise. It always seems to make the government bigger. And I don't think, I think that the Republican Party of 2008, including, hypothetical President McCain, would have gone for it. I don't think there's any doubt that McCain would have raised taxes if he'd been elected in 2008. But I don't think that the Republican Party today would nominate McCain, even if he were younger. And I don't think I think the Republican Party today is moving to the right on some of these issues. Border security is one, immigration is another. And I think taxes is another one. I don't think the Republican Party now would John Boehner and Mitch McConnell probably would not have voted for the bailout if it hadn't been for Bush 43 saying to them, look, this is absolutely imperative, you got to do it. As a matter of party loyalty as well as everything else, vote for it. I don't think that would happen again.
Isn't it healthy, too, that the Democrats have had to take responsibility for the war and for arresting this terrorist suspect and all these other things, that they can't sit on the sidelines and posture? They've had to take responsibility for it.
Right. Eric Holder could go down as the A. Mitchell Palmer of America of the 21st century if things continue as on the trend they're on now, right?
Well, you have to tell us about A. Mitchell Palmer so that we know what we're talking about.
A. Mitchell Palmer was the Attorney General of the United States under President Wilson at the tail end of World War I, and thereafter, and 1918 was a tumultuous. 1918-19 was a tumultuous time. You had the Bolshevik Revolution. You had all sorts of sort of little Soviet revolutions across Europe, however Hungary and Germany, and however brief. And you had a substantial anarchist movement or communist or something in the United States, and sabotage was on top of that. And so somewhere in there, I think it was 1919, somebody tried to blow up Attorney General Palmer's house in Washington, and whereupon he had a kind of predictable reaction of, okay, we're going to start raiding these people. And this is when Interpol comes from this era. And we just now have to have a crackdown on this kind of systematized terrorism. Now, as I'm sure all your colleagues at the University of Wisconsin would hasten to say, this was the worst period in American history. This is a dark chapter. Only the ACLU saved us from tyranny and police state and so on. Well, people can argue that, that the FBI got powerful during this period, just because people had enough of anarchy and craziness. We've been through this before, the periods of violence, and we've solved it through various mechanisms. And so, again, I agree with you. It is healthy for Democrats to have the experience of running the military, not just critiquing the military, running the Homeland Security Department, running the Justice Department, and so on. And if Eric Holder finds that he has less time to worry about affirmative action and racial quotas and so on, and has to spend his time worrying about keeping America safe, that's a good thing.
Good distraction for him. I'm looking over the Drudge Report and looking at this picture of the terrorist that was the bomber that was the alleged bomber. Looking in his photograph, it looks like one of these Facebook pictures where he's smiling into the computer. And this, he looks like every person on Facebook. Friendly. You would never. It's a strange world we live in where everything looks like social media. The picture of the suspect.
People are trained. People know how to pose for cameras. Ever since Khalid Sheikh Mohammed got that picture taken of him, with the T-shirt.
Why don't we have a picture with the hairy T-shirt?
At that point, right? They've learned. Look, you never know what's going to happen, so put your best foot forward because you want to look good for the camera. So actually, it's funny. I had this sort of a similar thought. There was a famous Russian Soviet movie actress named Lyubova Orlova in the 30s. And I just got curious about her one time, and went to YouTube, and sure enough, it takes a little while to find them because they're sort of entered into the YouTube system in Russian. So you got to sort of find it through reference as opposed to searching for because you won't find it just typing in the English name. But she made all these movies in the 30s, which are kind of, including one called Circus, which is about a black as an African American or African. Yeah, she born in America to a white mother and a black father, who then the child finds peace and happiness inside the Soviet Union. This is middle of the purges, middle of the Ukraine collectivization and so on. So Stalin was busy murdering tens of millions of people, but the Soviet propagandists were busy making a movie that was an implicit critique of American race relations at the same time in the 1930s, with the presumption being that, and I'm sure Paul Robeson fell for it, that the Soviets were being nice to minorities, whereas the Americans were mean. And I had this sort of similar thought of, look, propagandists everywhere are smart enough to know what the public mode demands, and so this guy has a nice Facebook page. Well, again, good police work is required to get past whatever veneer.
Yeah, we need to learn how to tell propaganda from things that are not propaganda.
Right.
I mean, this kind of loops us back to the original topic of whether people should be tested before they can become immigrants. I mean, I think that the most devious people can put on the false front and can fit in and camouflage themselves and do their propaganda to the intended audience. And so the people you catch in that net are going to be the more innocent people.
Maybe, but remember, the Israelis deal with this all the time. I mean, I've flown on El Al, and I imagine you have too at one time or another.
Oh, you're looking in the eye, and you can tell.
Yeah, well, I mean, one thing the Israelis do, because they really care about Homeland Security, is their Homeland Security training is a lot more West Pointish. I mean, it's only a few years ago that we were just hiring temps to run Homeland Security, and I don't think that was very satisfactory. And now there's you get a uniform and a badge, and you get a little bit of authority, and you just notice now that people going through, and I think I should hasten to say that I think the TSA procedures are idiotic. I think that you and me taking our shoes off is moronic. I think we should have some kind of profiling system going on. But to have a profiling system going on, you have to have talented profilers, and they've got to have a demonstrated capacity to get past and to at least come close to spotting devious people. But I would imagine the Israelis would say, look, having been busy profiling people for 40 years before anybody gets on an El Al flight, we've gotten pretty good at whatever, use the poker word that the tell, T-E-L-L, is for even devious people. I mean, lie detectors up to a point do kind of work.
Yeah. It seems like you really like this idea of a sort of a super, having a highly trained, highly expert government that knows a lot about its citizens and is has special expertise at looking into who is dangerous and typing people and looking into your eyes and knowing about. I mean, there's something a little bit 1984 about that. There's something a little bit un-American. I think Americans resist. It's great for the Israelis, but don't Americans kind of instinctively or foundationally resist this idea of the government knowing that much about us and having that kind of power over us?
I think there obviously is a lot of resistance. I think, look, the issue is if all the terrorist plots that people, including the underwear bomber, he came relatively close to blowing up an airplane and killing, 300 people in the plane and then unknown thousands potentially on the ground. Mm-hmm. If we can't look at that stuff and say, there but for the grace of God go we, in terms of the incompetence of the underwear bomber, this guy in Times Square, and see where we're headed in terms of the danger this country faces, then I think we're dreaming. And so it requires, and if you want to see a real crackdown, wait till after the terrorist attack happens. Then you'll see the Palmer raids once again. You'll see the internment of Japanese or the equivalent. So it would seem to me that you mentioned John F. Kennedy before. As this will be a paraphrase at best, if you don't allow peaceful revolution, emphasis on the peaceful, you'll get violent revolution. If you don't allow effective law enforcement and intelligent, enlightened, intelligent law enforcement, you're going to get a brutal crackdown afterwards. You'll get a pogrom.
So instead of the jackboot kicking down the door in the middle of the night, what we have is a highly sophisticated government kind of mining all our Facebooks and blogs and email.
I don't think by the way, and they already are. And let's not kid ourselves. If you send an email to Pakistan, I guarantee you the government's going to read it. Now, I guarantee Eric Holder will
Google is clearly reading it.
Google will read it, right? Google read it.
Google is serving us ads based on the text of our emails. So there are machines out there reading everything, right? So theoretically, that could be pulled out in some way.
Theoretically, come on, let's
beyond theoretically,
beyond
it is
theoretically.
Pulled out.
Right. If the Chinese and the Chinese, by the way, are reading them too. The Chinese hacked Google back in December. We now read. And whereupon Google turned to the National Security Agency and said, "Look, we need help." So the National Security Agency has assigned engineers to help Google hack-proof itself, and that to me is just the reality of if it's Google versus a sovereign country of 1.3 billion people, I don't care how smart Google is, they're going to lose. So Google, again, now Google and the government are now working together to keep Google hack-proof, which is good as a user of Gmail, and I think we both are. I'm happy enough that the Chinese can't hack into it, but I'm under no illusions that Google's reading it, as you said, because that's the whole raison d'etre of Gmail. And now I'm under no illusions that the government. I never have been under any illusions that the government's reading it. Again, I don't want the government. I don't care if you smoke pot. I would. DC, here is about to legalize medical marijuana. That's fine with me. I don't think the government should be regulating a lot of personal behavior, but I do draw a sharp distinction between, good old-fashioned deviance and criminal terrorist mayhem. And I think the American people could be persuaded that what gays and lesbians do is none of their business, but what terrorists do is their business, and the government may know about both, but will only worry about one.
But if in a world where people are destroying other people's careers because they happen to say something that about race the wrong way in a private email, I mean, maybe is the lesson that everyone needs to just don't put anything in your email, in your private communications, unless you want the whole world to see it, and maybe, we have, and that everyone is going to feel quite chilled in their speech.
Well,
I mean, you can say, well, that's already happened.
Yeah, it's already happened. I'll be interested. This girl, I think her last name is Grace. Something tells me she's gonna have a pretty good career. She'll apologize. She'll do something that gets her.
She did apologize. I mean, that's part of the problem. Why a lot of people are annoyed that she apologized. Why didn't she defend herself? Why didn't she stand up for herself? People apologize so quickly these days. I guess the idea is you'll just get in more trouble. Just apologize.
As Bill Clinton said, look, I did it, but now I'm moving on. Any more questions? I mean, in other words, the move on notion. Look, yeah, I did it. I'm guilty, but now I'm putting it behind me now. I mean, the same culture which attaches all this opprobrium to certain words and thoughts. That's one lobe, L-O-B-E, of that culture. The other lobe of that culture is a kind of dismissiveness where you say, okay, look, I'm over it now, and you should be too. And now I hire some PR person, and now we're talking about something else.
Or as Obama likes to say about any number of things, the time for talking is over. We already talked about that. That discussion is over. I like during the healthcare debate how it went on for over a year, and he was saying even in the beginning of the year the time for talking was over. Little did he know, we were going to keep talking. I mean, I sort of like the idea of keeping talking, but there are a lot of people who would like to repress speech. But speaking of keeping talking, we've gone over an hour.
We have. It's been fun. The time has flown. But
the time for talking is over now.
But now we have to go back to talking, but in a different venue. And it's been fun.
Fun talking to you.
Talk soon. All right.
Okay.
I'm stopping caption.